Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we have significant developments throughout the front line, especially in the Pokrovsk direction and Vuhledar directions. We start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians have managed to cut off the main supply road between the north of Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. They have now managed to gain a foothold here in the road and secured it. This is the first time the Russians have reached this point. Previously, we had seen direct assaults towards Vuhledar, which ended up in a failure. But now we see that the Russians have done a lot of positional fighting here to the east of this road. And now, for the first time since the war began, they've managed to cut off the road and gain control of it. This limits the supply that is able to be sent to Vuhledar. Now, there are a few off-road roads between Vuhledar and Vuhledar, so there is still a supply going to and from Vuhledar, but we see that with this cut off, there is no connection between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar other than a very wide area away from Vuhledar and all the way around, which makes it more difficult for Ukraine to supply, and it also limits the targets of Russian artillery and reconnaissance in the Vuhledar direction. So this complicates the Ukrainian defense of Vuhledar. However, there's no end to the Battle of Vuhledar until the Russians manage to closely capture areas such as the heights here northeast of Vuhledar and the fortified positions and roads connected in the western direction as well. So that is if they do the assault on Vuhledar in a roundabout way. If they do it in a direct way as they have tried before, it is more likely that they'll fail yet again due to the nature of the position of Vuhledar located in the heights with their high-rise buildings over open fields, with a river line that the Russians have to cross to the south or massive open fields to the east. This is why the Russians have been doing this positional fighting along the eastern parts of this road to try and cut it off and gain control of it. If the Russians gain proper control over the road, they'll be able to use this area here as a foothold to launch assaults on Vuhledar from the northeast as well, widening the front to 3 sectors, and at the same time gaining control of the heights will allow the Russians to monitor any movement in Vuhledar in real time. Therefore, we see that the situation is switching in favor of the Russians in the Vuhledar section of the front line. Further north here in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, we see several advances by the Russians. First off here, the Russians have managed to capture the fortified position of the Ukrainians northeast of Shelane. This very well fortified position of the Ukrainians has been a major obstacle in the Russian advances in the area, yet they managed to capture it fairly quickly in just a few days' time. This has allowed the Russians to gain a very strong position here near Shelane, and it's only a matter of time until the Russians capture Shelane itself, which will lead to the Russians having an open road between their positions all the way to the fortified positions near Novohorodivka and Mykolaivka. Therefore, we see that the current positional fighting right now is at the second line of defense of the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk direction. If the first line of defense was Prokres-Vovche and the Vovche River line, the second line of defense is one currently being fought over, and that is the connection from the northern villages through Ivanivka, through Vesele, Serhivka, and Shelane. The third line of defense would be Hrodivka and down south the village chain ahead of Novohrodivka, connected with Hrodivka as well. That is connected to Selidove. This will be a third line of defense. And then the final line of defense is again by Hrodivka and through to the south of Pokrovsk. Pretty much the third line of defense encompasses all of these defensive positions depending on the direction of the Russian attack. Russians can attack in a northern direction through Ivanivka, which will cut through the second line of defense, which has already been breached in several parts, into Hrodivka, after which the Russians will then move along the northern side to Myhnorad, which is the big defensive position of the Ukrainian area of Pokrovsk. The city of Pokrovsk itself is connected to Mirnograd, which is pretty much a suburb city, a connected city to Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians actually have a lot of military personnel stationed, and it is one of their main bases besides Pokrovsk. The Russian target would not just be Pokrovsk itself, but also Mirnograd. And if we see the Russians pushing through Hrodivka, then they will have breached the final line of defense ahead of Myrnograd. And at the same time, we see here in the south, they will likely push in the direction of Novhrodivka as well, which will then allow the Russians to move through by the railway towards Pokrovsk, and likely push along the fortified positions south of Pokrovsk. And we see the Russians already looking to be fighting over Pokrovsk and Myrnograd within, likely the battle will begin this month. This means that the Ukrainian position right now is very, very critical, because if they do not stop the Russian advance right now, then the Russians will very soon reach Pokrovsk, and that will be devastating for the Ukrainian presence in the Donetsk region, much less their ability to conduct offensive or defensive operations. It is likely that if the Ukrainians plan a counterattack, this will be one of the main axes, simply to stop a Russian offensive. To launch their own counteroffensive would be a viable strategy. They definitely need additional forces in the Pokrovsk section of the front line to hold the line, otherwise their entire defensive positions in the Donetsk region could collapse with the loss of Pokrovsk. In the Toretsk section of the front line, we see Russian advances both in the Toretsk section and in the New York section. Within New York, the Russians are attacking in 3 different directions: to the east, south of the river line, and to the east, north of the river line, and northwest, north of the river line. The northwestern direction is towards the central parts of New York, capturing the eastern part of the railway in the residential area. This will allow the Russians to strengthen their positions here and cross over on a wider front near the river line. The Russians have attempted to cross over here in the central parts, but the Ukrainian counterattack managed to push them back across the river line. This means that the Russians only have this one foothold across the river line. However, this is a large enough foothold for them to develop offensive operations in the area. It seems that the Battle of the Industrial Zone of New York could start very soon, and the city of New York will likely fall this month as well. If we look in the direction of Toretsk, we see a final push in the southern direction to cut off the final Ukrainian fortified positions east of the area along the Silizhna River, and this is an attempt by the Russians to connect the two sides between New York and Toretsk. Such a connection would cut off everything east of this connection. This is all of the fortified positions along New York. That's why we're seeing at the same time a push by the Russians in the eastern direction to speed up a Ukrainian withdrawal, and at the same time to try and cut them off in multiple directions to prevent the Ukrainians from reacting fast enough to withdraw. And if they react fast enough, then it will lead to a collapse of these defensive lines, which will strengthen the Russian positions in New York and allow for further push in the central parts. The Ukrainians need fewer soldiers in these fortified positions, and the Russians need to attack them. This is why taking control of these fortified positions will free up more Russian soldiers than it would free up Ukrainian soldiers. So we see that the situation is turning gradually in the Russian direction, and with these continuous pushes, these continuous assaults by the Russians, breaching the second line of defense, connecting the Toretsk front with the New York front, and generally just devastating the Ukrainian lines with heavy bombardment, and these non-stop assaults continuously improved the situation for the Russians and has sped up the Russian advance. And the situation has changed so much that previously the Ukrainians made fun of the slow Russian advances, saying that at the current rates, the Russians will reach Kiev in 30 years. Well, Julian Ripke did a quick theoretical analysis. The current rate of advance near Pokrovsk will lead to the Russians reaching Kiev in only 2 years. That is 15 times faster than they previously were advancing. This is my recap map that is only available for members on YouTube and Patreon. And we see that the advances of the Russians have significantly increased. It started specifically in February, where the Russians managed to capture a significant portion of Avdiivka and cause the collapse of the city. Since then, the Russian advances has numbered in the month of March about 20 kilometers, in the month of April about 52 kilometers, In the month of May, it was 60 kilometers. In June, it slowed down a bit to 36 kilometers. And then now in July, it was 64 kilometers, 64 square kilometers of area that the Russians captured here in the Pokrovsk direction. And a main part of that was in relation to the capture of Novoselivka Persha and the push further westwards of Progress to the capture of Timofivka in the north and Russians reaching Shelani, Serhivka and Vesele. This advance can continue, and within this current rate of advance, it will lead to the Battle of Pokrovsk starting at the end of this month. At the same time, we have to take a look at the fortifications of the Ukrainians. There's practically none in between the Donetsk region in the east and all the way to Kiev. This is just one straight line with hardly any fortified positions, at the very least not any that has been documented. And taking a look at what happened in the Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians, due to corruption, did not even finish their frontline defensive positions. Then what would have happened if any were planned in the Poltava, Kremenchuk, or Kiev regions? Kiev is naturally the most fortified city in Ukraine beyond that of the frontline positions, according to my sources. Therefore, Kiev is well fortified, but anything between Donetsk and Kiev, you can pretty much forget about it. And that just means that the slowest advance of the Russians will be in the Donetsk region, much less beyond it. Therefore, I predict that the Battle of Pokrovsk will start the beginning of the end of the Donetsk region, and if the Russians capture the Donetsk region, then beyond that there is either a Ukrainian surrender or the Russians will capture everything east of the Dnieper River. That is my opinion on the current state of affairs in Ukraine. I believe Ukraine will attempt a counterattack, but seeing how the current situation is a result of the previous failed summer offensive, then I believe if it fails again, then the situation will be much worse than it currently is. In the Sinkivka direction and Vuhledar direction, there were a few updates that I didn't catch in my last one, which is the Russians widened the frontier east of Sinkivka, capturing the rest of the first line. And in the Vuhledar direction, the Ukrainians actually managed to recapture the south of the Vuhledar river line, pushing the Russians back across. And with this, we see that the Russians only have a presence in the northern bank yet again. And that is the current situation all across the front line and throughout the situation in the country. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.